We must be intentional with our active listening skills. This is important for so many reasons, including some basics like building rapport and establishing trust. It ensures that we understand our colleagues and our clients' needs so that we can effectively address them. And listening will help reduce miscommunication. It helps us compile additional information, feedback, and objections so that we can continue to master how we approach our businesses. None of this can happen effectively without the ability to listen and to listen well. Welcome to Prospecting on Purpose. Our discussion of hard skills and soft skills continues. Last week, we discussed empathy as a core soft skill and 8 tips on how to focus on and practice empathy at work. This week, we're going to dive deeper into an element of empathy. I'm just going to call it empathy's partner in crime, which is the skill of active listening. This is still considered a soft skill because it's not something that's easily measured. But when we're in any type of leadership role or a role that requires us to influence others, the ability to listen well is not only going to make you more desirable to work with, but will also build more genuine connections with others and will absolutely uncover future business. It is vital to the success of business development. In 1957, 2 American psychologists, Carl Rogers and Richard Farson, coined the term active listening in a paper of the same name. And it means, as the name suggests, actively listening, fully concentrating on what is being said rather than just passively hearing the speaker. We'll call that passive listening. And then, of course, another category of listening is distracted listening, which is pretty self-explanatory, but I'm going to give some examples as we go through this on how it negatively impacts our reputation and relationships at work. Listening well is a complex skill, and we're going to get into 8 tips to improve your active listening with this particular episode and how to practice and work on these habits. And then at the end of our 8 tips, I'll tie it together with a bonus tip and then an example of a sales meeting and how listening impacts its success. I will mention that some of these suggestions may be more difficult for certain people as everyone learns differently and interacts and communicates in their own unique way. So just take what works for you. We must be intentional with our active listening skills. This is important for so many reasons, including some basics like building rapport and establishing trust. It ensures that we understand our colleagues and our clients' needs so that we can effectively address them. And listening will help reduce miscommunication. It helps us compile additional information, feedback, and objections so that we can continue to master how we approach our businesses. None of this can happen effectively without the ability to listen and to listen well. So without further ado, similar to our 8 tips for practicing empathy, we're going to get into 8 tips for active listening. And tip number 1 is to set an intention or clear goals for going into whatever situation you're approaching. Whether you're catching up with a friend, attending a presentation, an event, or a conference, both as an attendee and a presenter, or if you're running a sales call, chatting with your boss, any type of conversation, having clear intentions going into it is going to just set you up for success. And a very clear, easy way to do this is a script, an internal script. I'm listening to this person at this time about this topic. Tip number 2, similar to setting intentions, is to be present. One easy way to stay present is to literally work on staying present. Do not think about the past. Don't think about the future. Don't think about your next meeting. Don't think about what this person's saying and what that may mean for your future 5 steps ahead, right? This is where mindfulness really comes into play, staying present in the moment that you're in. And when someone that you're with is not present, it is very noticeable. A quick, easy example here. I'm sure we've all experienced this, probably as the person doing it and the person receiving it. But you're telling a story to a friend at a restaurant. You're having a great lunch. You're telling them this story, and they are looking around the restaurant. They're trying to make eye contact with people. They're watching what's happening out on the sidewalk outside. They're looking at their phone, right? They're just generally not paying attention. It makes you feel like your time and your story and what you're communicating isn't valuable, isn't of importance to the other person. Staying present is going to really set you up for an active listening situation. And then, of course, one of the best ways to truly pay attention and be present brings us to tip number 3, which is to remove distractions. This one should be obvious, but we all do it. Our phones, our watches, our laptops, email, television, basically screens large and small are always vying for our attention. And if you have something that's a common distraction, like your phone, put it on silent, put it face down during a meeting, or keep it in your bag or your pocket if you don't need it. If you're sitting at a desk and someone approaches you for a conversation, if it's appropriate, right? Can you turn your chair away from your computer and truly focus on them? Because it's going to be more efficient for you to have this quick conversation that you have by single tasking. And in this example, the single task is listening to the other person, responding, and moving on, move back to your task at hand. You're going to miss things on both sides if you do, and you're going to do all of these tasks less efficiently if you multitask as opposed to just single tasking, focusing, responding, moving on. This is especially important if you're having a phone conversation as opposed to an on-camera virtual meeting or an in-person meeting. I'm sure we've all had the experience when you're on the phone with someone, you're trying to have a conversation or get a quick answer so that you can move on with your work. And the other person is talking to you, but clearly reading and responding to an email while you were on the phone with them. And when this happens to me enough times with the same person, I will usually find a way to tell them, and it can be direct, but it can be gentle and to the point. One script I use is, hey, so-and-so, I can tell you're busy, so I'm going to let you go, but can we loop back to XYZ question so I can move on with this task, right? Sometimes you need to tell the person that it's clear they're not listening to you, and it's disrespectful. That's not how we want to leave others feeling. We're going to get into that more in an upcoming tip. So recapping tips 1 through 3, we have go in with an intention, be present, and remove distractions. This tip, number 4, is going to take a little bit more practice, but it's going to change the game if you can get it. Tip number 4 is do not plan your responses. One thing I notice when I'm interacting with someone who's a poor listener is that they're clearly waiting for you to be done talking so they can jump in and say their piece or tell a story of what happened to them, right? You're not actively listening if you're already crafting a message in response to something the other person said. And it shows itself. It's so obvious when it happens. I know as I'm speaking, you're thinking of examples of people or situations where this has happened to you. One quick example, a few years ago, I was in a meeting with 6 other people and we had to put together a small project. So it was a brainstorming kickoff call. And it was a group of people that normally didn't work together. So the normal flow was new, right? And so the person who's running the project, I'm going to call them the project manager. They set the tone, told us what the goal was, and threw it open mic for ideas. And someone came up with an idea. It was a good idea. The person running the project clearly latched onto that idea and then turned off his brain to all of the ideas that followed. So the other 5 people, second idea comes, that one's better. Everyone resonates with that idea more. Third idea comes, right? The whole team was brainstorming as a group. And 10 minutes later, the project manager was clearly still on idea number 1. And it came across very clearly that he wasn't listening to the team. And unfortunately, it did come across as unprofessional, and it didn't instill any sense of trust that that project was going to be executed well by that person. And we got through it. The project turned out great, but it was unfortunate. And that's what happens when we don't stay present and we're thinking 5 steps ahead. And then in the same category, I have to bring it up. It is the cardinal sin of active listening is interrupting. I'm guilty of it. I think most of us are guilty of interrupting others. I know in some cultures it is acceptable, and that's just part of the style of communication. But general etiquette in a business setting is not the ideal way to influence others, especially in a role like a sales role where we're trying to convince the other person to buy from us. In my personal opinion, this is my personal opinion, people who interrupt others are almost always coming from a place of insecurity and trying to appear that they're confident, when really the true test of your confidence is not planning your responses in advance. This is the ultimate demonstration of confidence. You're confident in yourself that you can be present Listen and be engaged in the conversation that's happening in front of you, and then navigate it to where it's going to go, what your response is going to be. You can still stay in the driver's seat, but it's going to be much more organic and natural to guide the conversation by being involved in it, as opposed to pushing your own agenda, because everyone can tell when that's happening. Please don't interrupt. And if it's something that you do as part of your communication style, I would encourage you to work on it. I have to work on a lot of these things too. If you'd like a deeper dive on confidence, you can listen to episode 20, 4 Pillars for a Confident Mindset. Confidence and arrogance are very different. And I would put interrupters in the arrogance bucket and confidence in the being present bucket. So if you haven't listened to that episode, it is actually the most popular episode on this podcast. So I encourage you to go take a listen. Tip number 5, super short, and I use it all the time. It is an acronym. It is the acronym WAIT, WAIT. It stands for Why Am I Talking? I personally am very chatty. Sometimes I have to remind myself to wait. Other phrases that I like in this same thread are we all have 2 ears. We all have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Very similar, right? Try to listen more than you're talking. And then tip number 6, kind of building on each other with some of these examples, is to remind yourself that it's rude to not be an active listener. And the reason why I personally feel that this is so important is that our communication style is part of our personal brand. And when I think of personal brands when it comes to work and professionalism, is how do I want other people to feel when they interact with me? Do I want to leave them feeling disrespected because I interrupted them, or that I didn't value their time because my email was too important for them to get my full attention, or if I clearly wasn't present or allowing myself to be distracted? Obviously, it happens sometimes, but as a general rule, active listening is going to leave the other person feeling like they're cared about. And I don't ever want to come across as rude to another person. So this is why this is so important. And then our last 2 tips, tip 7 and 8, are not going to surprise you. It's more specific on communication. So tip number 7 is utilize nonverbal communication. So when you're in a meeting, when you're in a conversation, what is the other person's tone and their communication style? What are their facial expressions demonstrating? How is their body language coming across? And then ideally, since we're paying attention and being present, our first 2 tips, we're going to be able to mirror and communicate non-verbally that we're listening. There are many ways that we can do this. A great one is to smile. Small smiles can be used to show that you're paying attention, and it's a way of agreeing. If you're sitting in a presentation, presenters up there, toss them a smile, throw them a bone, right? Of course, if the speaker is telling you a sad or discerning story, we're not smiling, right? We're mirroring their tone and their body language. In the same thread here, we can nod or shake our head as a way to communicate that we're listening. Maintaining frequent eye contact is a great way to demonstrate that you're paying attention. This may take some reading the situation to figure out how much or how little the other person wants to receive the eye contact. But if you're actively listening, you're going to get a feel for their comfort level, and you're marrying the eye contact with head nods, smiles, and then our verbal feedback that we're getting into next. And then the final piece of nonverbal communication that we already touched on, that's mirroring, usually an automatic reflection or matching the facial expressions and body language used by the other person. You know, body language is kind of the umbrella here. We're making sure we're open. We're not closed off. We're not, looking pissed off as we're listening. We want to be present and mirroring that body language. This is something that usually happens pretty naturally, so most of us don't have to work on it that intentionally. But if this is an area that you struggle, mirroring is a really easy tip to continue to remind yourself as you're listening, hey, let me match that other person. And then tip number 8, last and final tip, it's very important in a business exchange to show that you're listening, is with verbal feedback. So obviously small acknowledgements like, yes, mm-hmm, oh, wow, tell me more. What happens next, right? Little tiny fillers is a way to respond to what the speaker is saying without interrupting. Another part of listening is to ask questions, whether that's to keep the flow of the conversation going or to clarify something. Especially in a business environment, if you're a bit lost in the story or you don't understand something or you're confused on who was doing what, it's okay to ask for clarification. It's going to help you follow along more, reduce miscommunication, and it's a really easy way to demonstrate that you're listening. Another verbal feedback tactic that's similar to mirroring is you can repeat the last few words or points the speaker makes back to them. Direct repetition works well to help not only you retain information, but communicate to the other person that you're paying attention. And it's going to feel a little bit awkward, but it really doesn't come across awkward unless you're parroting everything the person's saying, right? But every once in a while throughout the conversation, repeat something back, especially if it's an important point. If you want to paraphrase, you can use a script like, I'm going to repeat this back to you to make sure I understand what you're saying. Or in my experience, I've always been in very technical conversations that is not always my zone of genius. So sometimes I will say, do you mind if I explain it back to you to ensure that I'm following along? I'm going to take the last couple points here and apply it to a sales meeting as an example. And it's just a really quick example. So if you'd like a deeper dive on this, I'd recommend you listen to episode 10 of this podcast, Understanding Our Client's Business Model, and episode 25, The Importance of Remembering Names. I will link all of these episodes I mentioned in the show notes. And this is going to be just kind of like a bonus tip here. In both virtual or in-person meetings, I personally recommend taking notes. It helps you retain information and ensure that we're capturing pieces of information. However, we're doing this with intentionality. We're not writing down everything the person's saying because that's not going to help us listen well. We're using the notes as a listening crutch. So in our example, let's say we're meeting with a new prospect. We met a woman named Brenda at a networking event, and now we have set up a formal meeting with her and her colleague to introduce them to our product or service. So Bob and Brenda, we're in the room with them, right? So just from a logistical standpoint, my phone is in my bag or it's face down at the table on Do Not Disturb. And we start by asking for their roles and their company business model. Here's a script. Here is a quick script. Brenda, thank you so much for setting up this meeting. Bob, Brenda shared such great things about you during XYZ networking event that we met at. It's so great to put a face with your name. Before we get started, I'd love to learn a little bit more about each of your roles at the company. And if you wouldn't mind to share a quick overview of the organization's business model. You know, I feel I have a nice grasp on what XYZ company does from Brenda and from my own research, but I want to ensure that I'm catering my comments to your needs and your roles. And then we listen to what they say. And if you need to jot down notes in your notebook or key pieces that they share with you, great. I personally, especially if it's a virtual meeting, it's so easy to write down people's names and what they do, and then you can reference back throughout the meeting. That is a powerful, powerful piece of influence there. And then, of course, we're combining our verbal and nonverbal communication, right? We're smiling, we're nodding, we're maintaining eye contact, like, oh, Bob, tell me more, right? All of these things are going to help communicate. And then, of course, as they're talking, I think this is one of the biggest pieces to actively listening, but staying in the driver's seat. If they tell you about a different department that you can potentially introduce one of your own colleagues or a different part of your business to a different part of their business, don't interrupt Bob's flow as he's talking. Just jot it down. And personally, I put either like a little cue for question, which means I have a question I don't want to forget, but I don't want to interrupt their flow. Or if there's an action item that they're going to need to send me something, I'm going to need to follow up. Same thing. I'll jot it down and just write a little AI in the corner for action item along that line. But what this does is that once Bob's done with his flow, or once Brenda's done with what her pain points are and what we're trying to solve, this is how we can still navigate the conversation, but not leave money on the table. And when I say leave money on the table, this is where when we ask questions, listens to the answer, this is where we find untapped business development opportunities. And we could only do that if we're actively listening. So at the end of the meeting, I usually summarize, like, okay, thanks for going through that with me. Can I ask you a couple clarifying questions, right? And then we go through my questions, we dive deeper. It helps you organically present, Bob, I really need to introduce you to my colleague, Tim. He has a product that's going to solve that need. That's a different department, but I really think it's going to help you. Let me take that as an action item to set up a follow-up meeting. If we're not asking questions and we go in with our own agenda and we just start going and we're 5 steps ahead, we're leaving all this opportunity on the table. So listening is such a big part of running a successful meeting, and it's going to change the game the more intentionally you focus on listening. So just some final thoughts on listening. This ties back to last week's episode on empathy. Be curious about everyone and do not make assumptions. You will always be able to learn something from someone else if you stay curious. People are interesting. And if you go into things without an agenda and by being present and by being a good listener, doors that you would never expect are going to open for you. And to close out, I want to share a quote from psychiatrist Carl A. Menninger. Resonated with me. I thought it was very cool. Listening is a magnetic and strange thing, a creative force. The friends who listen to us are the ones we move toward. When we are listened to, it creates us, makes us unfold and expand. I know podcasts are one-way communication, so I'd like to thank you for listening to me today. I will link the other podcast episodes mentioned in this episode in the show notes, and they dive deeper into soft and hard skills. And just like business, all of these things are full of nuance and interconnectivity, and that's what makes it fun. Thank you for tuning into Prospecting on Purpose, and I'll see you next week.